Now, just days out from the federal election, and Anthony Albanese has picked a fight with a highly reputable global ratings agency. The Prime Minister has scoffed and ridiculed the non-partisan agency for daring to raise concerns about its massive pre-election off-budget spending, its never-ending billions of dollars in election announcements to buy voters. Now, this should be a wake-up call for the Prime Minister, but instead, he's mocked the agency. It's an utterly astonishing response. Now, to recap, the ratings agency, Standard & Poor's, has issued a warning that Australia's AAA credit rating is at risk because of out-of-control spending. And this includes over $100 billion of spending that it hasn't actually been budgeted for. It's on the NBN, Snowy Hydro, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the pledge to pay $16 billion off every student's HECS debt, 20% of every student's HECS debt, among many other promises. Now, this is a serious warning, and here's what the ratings agency told Sky News Business Now.
What we are seeing is a lot of spending across both parties and minor parties as well, and we're really curious as to how it's going to be funded, and that's the real issue for us. Deficits of 2 to 2.5% of GDP are consistent with the AAA, but are they going to be there, or are they going to be more like 3 or 4% post-GFC levels? We don't know the answer to that yet.
So the agency says debt-funded election spending was pushing up government outlays to the highest since World War II. An extremely serious warning. But bizarrely, the Prime Minister isn't taking it seriously. He scoffed when asked a question about it on the ABC last night.
All of this adds up to what Standard & Poor's are saying is that there's too much spending and it's putting Australia's AAA credit rating at risk.
Well, there's no suggestion, frankly. The AAA credit rating is there.
So the Prime Minister's claiming there's no issue. When the ratings agency was so concerned, it issued a public statement in black and white days out from the election. Former Treasurers Peter Costello and Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg too, used to go to New York and sit down with the agencies and argue their case in official meetings. They treated the agencies with respect. They'd furnish them with information, explain their economic plan, and thus they managed to keep Australia's Rolled Gold rating. They certainly didn't mock the agency publicly, as Albanese went on to do in his very next sentence. And you wouldn't be surprised at this because Albanese isn't a serious, sophisticated player. He's juvenile. And he bizarrely went on, as you're about to hear, to deride the financial analysts at this respectable global ratings agency and then try to deflect his own economic mess by blaming the opposition.
They must have been beside themselves, whoever wrote that particular report, when the coalition left us with a $78 billion deficit. We turned that into a $22 billion surplus.
Now, two things about that statement. Firstly, it's factually inaccurate. The final budget outcome for the coalition's time in office was $32 billion, not $78 billion that he keeps lying about. And in fact, Frydenberg left the budget in a position for there to be a surplus, which he achieved through strong labour market and higher than expected commodity prices. Now, Albanese was even corrected on this by Phil Coorey in the Nine debate. So he knows it's not true, and yet he still knowingly continues to lie about it. And Trudy McIntosh and other journalists picked him up on this again today. Still, he wouldn't concede anything. Now, secondly, that derision that you heard there of the agency is unbefitting for a Prime Minister. And it could also backfire with S&P. If they were line ball on whether to downgrade, Albanese's comments are more likely to make them do so. His glass jaw has potentially threatened Australia's national interest. As former Treasury official Spyro Premitis wrote today in the Fin Review, Albanese is a leader who shrugs off credible criticism, is not reassuring the public, but is either demonstrating that he doesn't understand the problem or is choosing to ignore it. A typical response from Albanese, to bury his head in the sand. And Spiro writes, when a major credit ratings agency sounds the alarm on a government's fiscal trajectory, a serious national leader listens. They explain, they reassure, they set out a plan. He says Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did none of these things. Instead, he mocked the report's authors, dismissed the warning, and pointed to a temporary budget surplus as if that were the end of the matter. It isn't, and Australians deserve better. A strong piece from Spiro, and he says this fails the test of leadership. And thankfully, the Nightly's Latika Burke pulled Anthony Albanese up on his disrespectful comments about S&P today.
Prime Minister, last night you said, quote, they must have been beside themselves, whoever wrote that report. Now, if Peter Dutton questioned an independent expert in the way you did last night, you would be going full troppo and saying he was MAGA or Trump. So why is it okay for you to question the independence of experts? And Treasurer Jim Chalmers, if you lose Australia's AAA rating, will that disqualify you from being Australia's next Prime Minister?
Thanks, Latika. What I was doing last night was pointing out a fact that we have been responsible economic managers. And if you compare, and if you compare what our position was of 2 budget surpluses, compare that after we, under the Labor government, was what delivered the AAA credit ratings.
But this report is talking about your future record, PM. It's talking about the future, not yesterday's surplus.
In fact, the coalition kept the AAA credit rating despite the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And Albanese has now put it at risk during a time of stability. Albanese also ignores the fact that he's increased structural spending and that this has exacerbated inflation. And now this spending threatens our AAA rating. The Nightly's editorial says that, in other words, you can't ramp up public spending to stratospheric levels to disguise a recession, then ration it up even more with no plan on how to pay for it without expecting some long-term consequences. Somehow, in Albanese's upside-down world, this is the way out of a growing government debt crisis. Give people more stuff for free and call it responsible economic management. The Nightly says it's an absurd contradiction devoid of logic. And as you know, the Prime Minister prefers to blame inflation on overseas factors, on wars and Donald Trump.
That's why, through everything the world has thrown at Australia over the past 3 years, the worst global inflation in 4 decades, the biggest international energy crisis in half a century, and even now, trade tensions fueling new global economic uncertainty. Our government has faced these global challenges the Australian way.
This budget black hole that Labor's created is truly alarming. But if we lose our AAA credit rating, this could lead to higher debt servicing costs, slower growth, and even potentially higher interest rates. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor warned about some of this here on the show last night.
Now, S&P is telling us, the rating agency, that there's real risks now to our ratings. If our ratings drop from AAA, we will see impacts on interest rates in this country, impacts on government interest rates, but also interest rates for the economy more generally. And that's a very dangerous place to be taking Australia.
Yep, a ratings downgrade would be a vote of no confidence in the Albanese government, and the Prime Minister can't just shrug it off and pretend there's nothing to see here, as he's inclined to do.